treat the tenant well throughout the duration of the lease, you're going to have a much better chance of getting a well-qualified tenant to renew if you are addressing issues promptly, if you're communicating effectively, and the tenant has reasonable faith in you as the property manager or owner, that you're really taking care of the home.
Hey there, and welcome to the Investment Property Geeks of Charlotte. We are your hosts, Chris
And Jesse.
And today we're going to be talking about lease renewals, the art of negotiating.
That's right.
Yeah. So, hey, well, Jesse, go ahead, take from there. Sorry.
We had a plan for how we were going to do this episode. We're already deviating.
I always botch the plan.
No, it's all right. No problem with that. You can comment on this and that's exactly where I'm going with this. We appreciate if you leave us a review and subscribe, and we always welcome feedback from our listeners. You can also check us out on Facebook, or go to investmentpropertygeeks.com, or send us an email, podcast@investmentpropertygeeks.com. Again, we're happy to solicit as much feedback as we can, and if you want to talk about Chris doing things out of order, that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, you can just please don't write us a flaming review about it, but just discreetly through email let us know that you don't appreciate us not following our notes.
Yeah. We'd appreciate not to be blasted all over the internet. So as Chris mentioned, we're talking about lease renewals and negotiations with tenants. And really, we're going to talk about a couple different things. First and foremost, why? Why is the renewal process important? Chris,
Absolutely.
I'll let you. There you go.
Yeah. So really, the first thing that kind of comes to my mind is around turnover. So, for those who don't really know what that means, turnover is when you've got a tenant moving out and you're getting the property ready for the next tenant to move in. And anyone who's been doing this for a while or has listened to enough podcasts knows that that's one of the more expensive, if not most expensive, things that can happen in your business, because you have a business now of renting out your home or an investment property, is turning the property over. There are a few reasons for that. One, some damage can happen on move out. So, tenants are moving, maybe they're moving a washer and dryer up and down the stairs. Or I think about me when I was in college. I had the stupidest stuff in college. Like, I was always very independent as a kid. So my parents, my brother sold me this huge oak entertainment center that was maybe, I don't know, 6 or 8 feet long by 6 feet high. And it had to weigh easy 300 or 400 pounds with glass and lights and everything.
And how many different apartments did this move in and out?
This moved into at least 2.
See?
Yeah, by myself. And getting that bad boy up the stairs. Mm-hmm. And I know I dinged some walls.
Yep. Yeah.
in and out. And so you got stuff like that. That kind of, it's not really normal wear and tear if you're dinging up walls, but that stuff happens. That's not even usually the biggest piece of the turnover expense. But there is, kind of normal wear and tear. And that would be things like, hey, if I've got walls that have some dirty marks on them, or shadowing, if you've hung something up on the wall, or the carpets are generally soiled, or things need to be cleaned, or the little pulls break off of blinds. I guess new blinds don't have that anymore. They're all cordless, but just little things like that you can't charge a tenant for, that are just going to happen as part of someone living in your house. That stuff all needs to be repaired and fixed on move out. And the reason why, we've talked about this before, where like attracts like. You want to make sure you're getting that best quality tenant in there. And we would not encourage anyone to defer maintenance or anything like that. But there's kind of this with a new tenant comes new expectations, and no one wants to move into someone else's mess.
Exactly.
Or they go in and they're like, I want it to feel new. It's a new place. And then once you're living there, especially if you're the one that put the little handprint on the wall or whatever, you're kind of like, it's not a big deal. I did it anyway. So you're not gonna, want to get that fixed necessarily right away. And so that's where, if you can keep a tenant in there for a long time, for many years on end, you can really help minimize some of those costs. And certainly you still want to take care of them, and every once in a while, even if you've got a 10-year or 20-year tenant, you're going to want to replace the carpets every once in a while. You're going to want to paint for them every once in a while, but it's not going to be nearly as often. I get asked all the time, like, what's the average turnover? At least a few years back when I looked it up in Charlotte, it was something like 20 months was like the average lease duration. We usually see a little longer than that. But yeah, so you kind of got to figure on, some people that are moving here are moving for different reasons. Like, some people, a lot of people are moving out of state and they just want to rent for a little bit and then figure out where they want to live. Other people are lifelong renters, and that's great too. And so, sometimes someone might rent a house for a year, might be 2, might be 3. You might get lucky and they might be a lifelong renter. And maybe they want to live there a really, really long time. So
best case scenario, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. There's another reason this is important. So there's the physical cost of the turnover itself, and related to that is
vacancy.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So, first and foremost, of course, as you are a property owner, that's lost income. Anytime you don't have a qualified, well-paying tenant sitting in your home, you're losing income. Another issue, and we talked about this in episode 4, is related to insurance, actually. If your home is sitting vacant for too long, I think, was it 60 days?
Yeah. And I'm guessing each policy might be a little different, but I've heard 45, I've heard 60 from Rob.
There you go. So ballpark 45 to 60 days, depending upon the policy. But after a home sits vacant for that period of time, there are actually elements of the insurance policy that will no longer cover things that are happening in the home. So that could be a huge liability for you. And that is something nobody wants, obviously.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's certainly something that you want to be thinking about. And hopefully it's rare that something like that should happen, but you never know it could. So
yeah, kind of, as we've said before, prepare for the unexpected.
Right. And like you said, Jesse, I mean, the lost income, that's, potentially thousands of dollars depending on the price point of your home. And
it could certainly add up. And then we'll get into this a little bit later, but the time of year is also going to really factor into that too.
Sure. Yep. Absolutely. All right. So that's why renewing your lease is important if you can. There are certainly some instances where you don't want to renew, which we'll talk about too. So how do you go about the renewal? And this episode today is going to be pretty straightforward, but we'll have some practical tips in here. As always, we love to give you little golden nuggets, practical things that you can do on your own.
Yeah, and the first might sound like something so obvious, but it's 100% accurate. Treat the tenant well throughout the duration of the lease. You're going to have a much better chance of getting a well-qualified tenant to renew if you are addressing issues promptly, if you're communicating effectively, and the tenant has reasonable faith in you as the property manager or owner, that you're really taking care of the home.
Yep, absolutely. And several episodes back, we talked about getting moving on up. Go back and listen to that episode. I don't remember right off the top of my head exactly which number it was. But it was about what do you need to do to get the property ready? And we talked about, hey, like when they first step foot in that door, you've potentially lost the renewal already if you're not careful. So Jesse gave an example about one of the properties that he moved into and how messy it was, and just how much of a turnoff that is. So just be thinking about, like, from the very get-go, your goal is like to keep the tenant there. If they continue to be a great tenant throughout the course of the lease, because hopefully you've done your screening, like we've talked about before, and they've been, you're confident they're going to be a good tenant. Now you want to retain them, and you're not always going to be able to retain them. Hey, if they're moving to the area for a year and they know that and they're looking for a new place, okay, you're not going to retain them. But, otherwise you have a decent shot at least renewing for a year or so. So make sure like Jesse said, throughout the course of the lease, you're fixing things promptly and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And then again, another thing to do before offering any kind of renewal, make sure you're doing at least one inspection. Now, we're encouraging people to do more than that throughout the course of a year, of course.
Right.
But at a minimum, get out to that property, make sure you know what condition it is currently in before you're going ahead and offering an existing tenant a renewal.
Yeah, and we've talked about that before too in prior episodes, and there are a number of reasons you want to do those inspections, but certainly, yeah, you do want to get your eyes on it before you offer that. Just don't get so complacent where you're like, hey, I get a check every month, like I don't need to go out to the property. Oh, she or he wants to renew, great, I'm just going to keep collecting money. Well, maybe you don't want them in there because they might be making you less money than you think they are if you haven't seen the property. And just because they act nice we've had tenants who are just the nicest people, treat everyone with like great, respect and pay on time and are so polite and easygoing. And then sometimes they could just be slobs. And you may not want that person in there depending on how they're treating the property.
Exactly.
And so you kind of have to separate the person from how they're treating the property. I've said it before, I'll say it again. This is a briefcase full of cash. 100,000, 300,000, 500,000, whatever it is. So, do you want a tenant with a match living in your briefcase full of cash? Like, probably not. So this is your opportunity to say, hey, let's reevaluate, and this might not make as much sense as we thought initially. Hopefully that's not the case, but sometimes that will happen.
Yeah, and you want to prepare for that.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
And then, of course, the renewal, you're going to send that. That's got to be written. We never want that to be verbal.
Yeah, exactly. You want to have that written. Email's probably going to be okay. Just make sure that your lease doesn't state something to the contrary. I have seen some leases that'll say like, hey, it has to be delivered via certified letter, blah, 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 blah. I wouldn't do that. Now, I'm not an attorney, so I'm not going to tell you for sure that email is going to be okay. But you want to have something that you can go back to if there are ever any questions about, hey, well, you said this amount and you didn't give me adequate notice or whatever. You can go back there and cross your T's and dot your I's.
Yeah, even though we're not lawyers, that's the first question someone's always going to ask. Well, where is it in writing?
Yeah,
So.
Yep, exactly. I think if you do it in writing, then people, generally speaking, aren't going to really argue. But it's easy to argue with he said, she said.
Oh, absolutely.
Cool. So, thanks, Jesse. So you're gonna send them that in writing. The other piece, kind of about how you're gonna do it. Let's talk a little bit about like you got to do your research, right? So you don't just go throw out some. There are people that do this. Well, I think I should be able to get at least $100 more because it's pretty.
It's like throwing a dart at the wall, Yeah.
Or here's another popular one that we get. Well, my mortgage is $1,600. I'm only getting $1,475 in rent, so I'm going to bump up rent by $125. Okay, what's the logic you use there? Well, I just told you my mortgage is $1,600. It's like, I'm sorry, but that's not the way the world works.
Right.
You got to do it based on the market.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a few questions that we ask when we're thinking about, what rate do we offer the tenant for renewal? And here's kind of what we look at. We look at one, do we have some data or some thoughts about how long it took to lease the property the last time we leased it? We ideally have, 2 to 3 weeks of vacancy or so between tenants. That usually gives us enough time to go ahead and do everything we need to turn the property. I mean, in all honesty, ideally it's very little time of vacancy, but it's very rare that you have absolutely nothing to do to a property in between tenants. And so ideally it's like 2 or 3 weeks. If it takes a lot longer than that, then that's a clue that maybe it was priced too high last time. So when you're going through and looking at your new data, you want to take that into account. Or you might say, like, sometimes you put something out there and the next day it's leased and you might go, that I probably maybe left a little bit of opportunity on the table. So maybe I can bump it up a little bit. Just be careful and don't get greedy. Like, what is it called? It's like, I don't know. Pigs get something, hogs get slaughtered. I don't remember what it's. I don't
Close.
know. I'm like the king of botching quotes.
That was close. Someone can comment on Facebook and tell us what that actually was.
Put it in the here's my challenge to you. Put it in your review or tag us on Facebook if you can finish that quote. That'll be the Easter egg of this episode. See if you can do that. All right. And also be thinking about not only how long did it take to lease a property, but how many showings did you get, how many inquiries, and how many applications. If you're standing around waiting forever for an application, or, hey, I got tons of inquiries and lots of showings, but hardly anyone turned in an application, well, that might be a clue that perhaps your property is not as updated as you think, or it shows worse than it does in the photos. That's often what that means. When we see someone who gets a lot of inquiries on a property and then a lot of showings, that means they really liked the marketing and they thought it was potentially going to be a good fit. And then once they got there, they went, ugh. And that could be one of two reasons. One, it looks like, or the price tag for what they get is, Mm-hmm. And so be thinking about that too. And if this is be a good time during the renewal to be thinking about, should I maybe upfit this property a little bit, replace the floors, paint, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And then I also would say look at what has rent done in the zip code over the last year. Now, there are a couple different ways you can do that. If you're super geeky like we are, Zillow puts out some free data. If you just Google like Zillow data or Zillow research, and you can get data by zip code, and you can take and it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. Most properties, if they're posted for rent, are going to be posted on Zillow. Most of the legitimate ones anyway, not everyone, but most of them. So there's a lot of good data out there on Zillow. And so if you go there, you can download the spreadsheet. And again, this is where if you have a property manager, they can do it for you, unless you're totally nerdy like we are. But you go into the spreadsheet and you take a look at that zip code and say, hey, what is rent? What was like the median rent for this zip code in this month? And then you look a year ago or whenever the lease started, what was the median rent? And then you can kind of calculate what's that percentage increase. Now, for us in Charlotte, the greater Charlotte area, we have seen, and maybe we should do this as an episode sometime of like exactly what all this looks like. But, typically it's 3 to 5%, at least over the last couple of years. That's what we've seen. Some zip codes, it's 0 though. There are some zip codes where rent literally held flat for an entire year. There are other zip codes where it went down a tiny bit. So we might just hold rent steady there. And then there are other zip codes that saw like an 8% plus increase. And that's kind of tough, for a tenant, like, hey, surprise, Merry Christmas, 8% rent increase. But you might be able to ease in that. We'll give you a couple tips on maybe how you can play with that too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but typically, but don't make it arbitrary. I guess that's my point. Like, come back to the tenant, and you don't want, when they're like, "Why did you raise my rent?" You want to be able to say, "Well, because I did this analysis, I looked at what other properties are renting for, what we rented it for last time, how long it took, da 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 da, and here's what the fair market rent is, and then here's what your offer is." And that's pretty hard to complain about. Like, you can complain about it, but
yeah, well, and people will, of course, but there's a science to it, and it's a business transaction. Keep that in mind at the end of the day.
Right, because I think at the end of the day, all you're trying to tell the tenant is like, hey, look, I'm trying to be fair to you, so I put some time into researching this to make sure that I'm fair to you and I'm not gouging you. And at the same time, I want to make sure I'm not leaving money on the table.
Yeah.
So do your research, do your homework, and then that'll help you too in your conversation with the tenant. And I think most people are reasonable, and they just don't want to feel like they're getting one pulled over on them. So once you explain, at least for our tenants, when we explain this, like, hey, this is how we came up with this number, they usually go, oh, okay, well, I don't really like it, but I get it. But that's part of life. Like, there's this thing called inflation, and if you don't like it, go join a communist country or something.
I was just going to say, you're not going to beat inflation anywhere unless you're,
I don't know. They probably have the worst inflation of all. I don't know communism. I'm not sure how that works. Well, you would know, the economist here. I don't know how that does in a communist country, does it have lower or higher inflation?
TBD. I'm going to come back to you on this one.
Maybe Jesse's going to have to come back to
I do. That's a good question, actually.
Yeah, I'm trying to think through
the logic of that.
Logic and how that would all work. I would think more, because I would think if the government's providing more services and they have more control, wouldn't they be more likely to print money?
In theory, yes. So we're going to have to prove this theory. Now, this has nothing to do, by the way, with helping you renew a lease.
Well,
but it's still,
I know
it's
a tangent, but it's related, because really, what is rent increase? A rent increase is inflation.
Absolutely, it is. Yeah.
And that's the beautiful thing about owning. One of many beautiful things about owning real estate is, hey, if you get here's what I'll say. So there are a couple reasons rent increases happen. One is because demand. Well, okay, by a couple I mean several. That's not technically correct. Okay, so one could be demand in the area for that property increased for several reasons. The area's gotten cooler. Okay, maybe like NODA or something, right? Going through some revitalization. Or maybe there are more people now working in that area. An employer came or whatever. It might simply be because there are more people moving here. The other potential reason is that supply has decreased. And the last reason is inflation. And that's something that's typically pretty consistent. And the cool thing about owning a hard asset like real estate is, in general, the rent you get for your property is going to keep pace with inflation. So like right now, as we as a country are printing money like crazy, going into more and more and more debt, and I'm not going to get political about it or anything, it's just like the facts of it, right? It's really bad to have cash in the bank right now because it is getting devalued. Every day you have a cash in the bank, it's worth less and less and less and less. And with interest rates so low, you're not really going to be earning much on that. So how do you help combat the inflation? You buy hard assets that tend to, over time, keep pace with inflation. So that's what rental increases is. So anyone that looks at, because I think part of the reason we're seeing these crazy spikes in rent is because we are getting, so much money is being thrown and printed into the economy. And so that comes in the form of rental increases. There are, like we talked about, those other reasons too, but I don't even know what I was talking about before. I'm so sorry. I got off on a tangent. Real estate good. Cash bad. I guess that's where we are.
And I'll need to come back and we'll discuss communism versus capitalism.
Yeah, communism versus capitalism. Jesse's got to come back now. He owes you guys. An answer, and we'll see.
I owe it to myself. I want to find this out.
I'm very curious. We're going to do our research, and then we're going to give you our expert, unofficial opinion.
A 30 to 60 second overview during our next podcast. But absolutely.
Awesome. All right. So look at what rent has done in the zip code or neighborhood if you can. That's what we're talking about. Comping, we call it comping in the biz, for short. I only say that because every time I write comp in Word, it doesn't know what I'm talking about.
Right.
So, comping a property, we're going to say that's an actual word. And then you want to take a look at what are the other neighboring properties renting for as well. Like we've talked about before, when you're pricing that, make sure you're looking at things, not just what it rented for, Jesse, in the bedrooms and bathrooms, but what are the other things you want to look at and make sure you're comparing apples to apples.
Amenities of the property.
Sure. Such as?
Granite countertops versus Formica.
Okay.
Do people still have Formica kitchen?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We installed some Formica in a student rental just last week. It's all good.
Gosh, how about that?
You can still put Formica in. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to put granite in.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. I'm thinking of that old school 80s Formica that I grew up with up in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Gosh.
I had light blue growing up. It was like sky blue Formica growing up as a kid with oak cabinets.
Yeah, actually, ours was the kind of green with the oak cabinets.
Yeah, it went with the duck. I don't know if you guys ever had this on like the electric burners on the stove, like the covers that go on those. Do you ever have those? Ours were like these ducks with like this blue paisley background, and it went beautifully with the blue Formica countertops.
Man, we did some weird things.
Yeah, I know. Thank goodness no comment. My mother, my poor mother. Yeah.
So we'll listen to this at some point.
Sorry, Mom. No offense to your interior decorating in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, exactly.
It was probably cool back then, like our gray walls are now.
Yeah. Someday we're going to look back on gray walls and
someone's going to be like, ew, gray?
Yeah, why?
Wow,
yeah,
gross.
Exactly.
You didn't have any like roosters or anything out? Like no flamingos in the yard? Like what? Yeah, I know.
But going off on a tangent, we're talking about Formica versus granite. But you're right. It's not just granite. What other features does your house have versus the house down the street? And what did that house go for versus what yours is currently going for?
Thanks for putting the train back on the tracks.
I'm here to do that. That's bringing us back in.
Also, there's a cool tool that's on our website. If you go to sunnon.com, that's sunnon.com, and you click on Get My Free Quote, you can put in there your address, and you will get out a sweet PDF report within a few minutes of what your property is estimated to rent for. And on there will be like a little confidence score, percentage score. If that bad boy is somewhere in the 90s or mid to high 90s, chances are pretty good that's going to be really close to what the fair market rent is. If it's less than that, it becomes more questionable. It might mean that there's more variety in the rents around you or not quite enough data. And so that's where, a property manager or someone like that can kind of help dig into that a little bit more. But I'll be honest with you, we do a lot of, we use that tool. We also use the MLS, which if you don't have access to the MLS, you got to find someone like a property management company, realtor, someone who has that access. And then we also use Zillow too. Like we'll cruise Zillow because, the owners that are a big part of the rental market is DIY owners. And and they're not putting their stuff in the MLS. Now, this tool that we have on our website actually pulls from Zillow and some of those other places too. And what's kind of cool is it'll tell you property, not just active properties on Zillow, but it actually looks at properties that have gone off market in theory that have closed. So anyway, so I guess what I'm saying is try to get, there's Rentometer, there are a few other places, try to make sure you're like poking around and figuring out exactly what yours is going to rent for and what other people are offering, that kind of thing.
Yeah, know your range based on all of these different factors before you're going and just throwing out an arbitrary number.
Sure, yeah, exactly. And that kind of gives you a basis for negotiation, because kind of like when you price your property, put it on the market, you're probably not going to get it right on the money the first time. So you might have to kind of start toward the middle high end of the range and then work your way down or whatever.
Adjust as necessary.
Absolutely. Okay. I don't know what that voice was. Consider letting the tenant know. So once you've done all this research and it comes down time to tell the tenant, like, give them a little bit of a break. This is going to sound counterintuitive. A lot of people are probably, especially if you haven't been doing this for a while, you're going to go, what? Why? Properties in ship shape, etc. People have been doing this a long time go, oh yeah, I know, that's what I always do. Now, I'm not telling them give them $100, $200 off rent, but make sure they know, like, you're going to give them $25 a month, $50 a month, something like that off of what the fair market rent is, because you appreciate them and you would like for them to stick around. Now, don't get an additional $25 each year behind. Just make sure, like, every year, hey, if rent's supposed to be $1,600 based on what the market says, $1,575, and tell them, hey, look, fair market's $1,600. If you leave, that's what I'm putting it up for today. But we'll renew with you for $1,575 or $1,560 or whatever, it might be.
And this should be in line with the relationship that we talked about before that you should have with the tenant. You're fixing things promptly. You're working to make sure that they have a clean, safe, and comfortable place to live. And then going back and offering them, hey, $25 off potentially of that fair market rent. Yeah, that can be a big difference. You're showing the value or you're appreciating the value that they are bringing to you as a good quality tenant.
Yep. For sure.
That being the case, and I know we've been talking a little bit about this, and I know it sounds like we're all over the map on this. Here's how I'll try to summarize it. Don't fall into the trap of never raising the rent.
Yes.
As we're talking through this, do your homework, find out, okay, rent did increase, say, 6% in the market where your home is. Accordingly, I'm going to adjust up or down, but go back to the tenant, like we said, consider offering them a discount if they're good and you're trying to get them to renew, but don't ever sit there and say, well, they're a great tenant and they're just going to sit in there for 5 years at the exact same rent. You're never going to keep pace with inflation, which, as we learned, is a big thing for Chris. Sticking point, but no, it's true. It's exactly true. You basically, you're leaving money on the table. You're never going to have enough for the repairs on the property either if you're not planning accordingly. And you're setting a bad precedent. I mean,
yeah,
you don't want the tenant to just be in there at the same exact rate for years on end.
Right. Yeah. Well, you kind of get stuck in that trap of, like, after 1 or 2 years of not raising the rent, you go to raise the rent, they're probably going to move out.
Exactly.
Especially because now, and that's what I tell owners too, when they're like, hey, should we raise the rent? It's like, yeah, because most Americans, unfortunately, this is where I'm going to be like a little bit direct. Most Americans are really bad with money and they don't budget well. And so, Jesse and I were talking a little bit offline earlier about, like, the statistic around how few people have like $1,000. Like, if most people, if like the transmission went out in their car, they wouldn't have the cash to pay for it, which is just crazy. And so if you think about, hey, if you've got to go bump up rent by $75 and that's $750 for the year, most people that might be a little bit of a big deal too. Now imagine if you hadn't done that for 3 years in a row, and now we're talking a couple $3,000.
You're leaving a lot of money on the table.
Yeah, you're leaving a lot of money on the table. Plus, it's such a big. You have to almost help. It sounds weird, but you kind of have to help your tenant budget to some degree. Yeah. Like, now, don't get me wrong. There are some tenants out there that are super financially savvy and very successful. And I mean, we've got some tenants where, we review income and stuff, and I'm like, wow. Good for you. So there are definitely people out there that are very financially educated and very well off. in general, though, I would say like help people budget, help them, I guess, be the steward of their budget a little bit by not sticking it to them all at once with a few $100 rent increase every 3 years. Try to phase it in over time.
Yeah.
The other thing I'd say is this doesn't so much happen in single family homes, but in multifamily, the value of the property is actually based off of the rents. It's really based off of the net income. So, great example. If let's say you have this unit that happens to be a multifamily property and you had not raised the rent for several years and it's increasing at 6 or 8% year over year, and maybe you get up to the point where it's $200. Well, that $2,400 a year would have gone straight to your bottom line. And in the multifamily world, that could be a magnitude of like, you could get like maybe a 20-time multiple on that, if like a 5 cap, if that's what things are trading at. You might get a 20-time multiple on that, which is what, like $48,000. So that's like so it's not $2,400 for a couple of years you're leaving on the table. At that point, you're leaving like the better part of 50 grand on the table when you go to sell that bad boy. So that's how important it is, and that's how investors value property. So just be thinking about that. Like, hey, I gotta, and like Jesse said, you want to have enough money to do the repairs when they come up. Like, wow, when the water heater goes out, wouldn't it have been really nice to have an extra $1,000?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, because otherwise you're behind on everything and constantly trying to play catch up.
Yeah, and then the value of the property degrades because now you don't have enough rent to cover the maintenance, and then you lose money then on the sale and the transfer because you never had. And it's just this like downward spiral where worse begets worse.
Mm-hmm.
So
another tip that, and we kind of alluded to this before, considering offering an upgrade to a qualified tenant. I keep saying qualified tenant, but an existing tenant who is well qualified for that renewal. And Chris gave a great example. We were talking offline before. You know, you might have a home and 3 of the 4 bedrooms have ceiling fans and the 4th bedroom doesn't. Well, hey, you know, we know that you're using that as your home office. Everybody's home for COVID right now. Yeah. So why don't we consider throwing in that fourth bedroom ceiling fan for you? Or, you know, hey, let's replace your appliances with all stainless steel appliances right now. Nothing worse than walking into a house and seeing like the black and the white and the stainless steel. There's no consistency to it. So these are small things you can do to entice that tenant to stay, but you're also improving the value of your home just by, you know, you're kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone.
You know, I'll have to tell a funny story. I walked into a property I was about to buy. I was not about to. I was thinking about buying as a multifamily one time back in Seattle. And there was this sweet little old lady that lived in this property, and she'd probably been there for like 20 years. And she could not stop going on and on about the fan, the range vent fan that was over the stove.
How effective it was?
The landlord had replaced it for like 3 years earlier because he's like, you know what? You've been here for 15 years. I know you hate that thing. I tell you what, you pick out any fan you want. I don't care how much it is. I'll buy it for you.
Wow.
And so she bought like this $600, like really nice vent. And he looked at it like, okay, well, I just improved my property, you know, and she was so tickled about it. She was talking to a complete stranger 3 years later, telling him how awesome it was and how great it was that he did that. So that lady will probably be there until, you know, until she kicks the bucket. I'm guessing.
Yeah, but little gestures can go a long way.
Yeah, they can. And so they can, like, it sounds kind of trivial, but they can make a big deal. And sometimes it's just that little nudge you need to kind of get it over the finish line. Like, hey, I know, you know, we got to bump up rent by $50. I'm really sorry. I tell you what, if you sign another year lease or 2-year lease or whatever, why don't we throw in a kitchen faucet, fan, whatever.
Was it like a turbocharged fan or something?
I don't know. It wasn't even. It was stainless steel.
Did Boeing design it? Like,
yeah.
I mean, like the way you're describing this, man. But you know, again, hey, it did the trick and it kept her there. So
yeah, I don't know. Maybe she cooked something really stinky all the time. Fish, maybe. I don't know.
Well, either way, she was happy.
Yep.
So. The next thing, another important consideration is when to do this. We are right now doing it 60 to 90 days out. Well, we as a company do it 60 days out, but 60 to 90 days is probably going to be good. I say the more you can get in front of this, the better you can plan.
Right. Yeah. I think how we kind of have it structured is within 90 days, our checklist kicks out of what properties we need to start doing the analysis and everything on. I think it's like day 75 or something like that. The tenant kind of gets this courtesy notice like, hey, FYI, just a reminder, you know, your lease, you got to give us your renewal here in a couple more weeks. And then we give them like what the actual renewal offer is. And then we also tell them like, hey, by the way, if you go month to month, it's very expensive. You don't want to like, you can go month to month, but again, it's very expensive. And guess what? None of our tenants are month to month.
Yeah.
By design, because that's just like, that's a difficult kind of business to be in. It's unpredictable, and the last thing you want is, on Thanksgiving you get your 30-day notice that they're moving out on Christmas.
Yeah, it's gonna ruin everybody's holiday.
Yeah, exactly. So try to give yourself some buffer there. But I guess check your lease too. Make sure you understand what your lease says about how much notice they have to give.
Yep.
And it's up to you how lenient you want to be. Like, I'll be honest with you, ours says 60 days, but at the end of the day, if the tenant like drug their feet and now it's day 30 and they say, hey, I want to renew, and we haven't listed it yet for one reason or another or something else, I mean, we're going to renew the lease. Like, it's in the owner's best interest to renew, right? So we're still going to renew the lease. So don't be like, hey, it's day 59, I'm kicking you out. Again, your goal is to renew, but anyway, so just use some common sense. But anyway, use like, you got to make sure you uphold your end of the deal so you're getting them the notice by the right time, but also use some common sense in it. But give them enough time to plan.
Yeah, if you're teeing that up for them, and I mean, sometimes, like you mentioned, Chris, that 75-day notice going out, some tenants aren't even thinking, oh my gosh, my lease is up. I mean, it's just kind of a...
Yeah. You get like in the groove of life.
Oh, of course.
Right? And
it's easy.
12 months can go by pretty fast, unless it's 2020. And it's painfully
You took
slow.
the words right out of my mouth. I don't even know, what month is it? I don't even know.
Yeah. Is it Tuesday? All right. Let's see. So what if they don't want to renew? So sometimes folks have a good reason for not wanting to renew. Maybe something came up in the middle of their lease. They got frustrated. Maybe more often than not, like, hey, I'm moving because I got in a relationship or got out of a relationship is another one.
Life happens.
Life happens. Yep. Or, hey, got a new job, or buying a house, that kind of thing. So that stuff all can happen. So think about, like, it doesn't have to be black and white 12 months. Think about other options. Like, hey, so ask the tenant some questions. Like, hey, do you mind if I ask why you're thinking about not renewing? Why are you thinking about leaving? When are you thinking about? What would be the ideal timing for you? And then see if that works for you or lines up with your expectations. Maybe you can sign a 3-month, 4-month, 4.5-month lease extension. Those are all things. You can do whatever you want. We will do that for folks sometimes. They're like, hey, I'm buying a house, but I don't close for or I'm building a house, but I don't close for 4.5 months. So I don't really want to sign a 12-month lease. I guess I just shouldn't sign and I should move somewhere else. And I'm like, well, no, we'll sign a 4.5-month lease extension.
Right.
Like, that's okay. We could do that. And then if that lease extension ends in a period that's far less favorable to rent in, like maybe right now their lease is up in July and they want a 5-month lease extension and now it's going to be up in December. Well, instead of charging them, if rents went up 5% during that time, you're going to have increased vacancy or a harder time renting that property come December. So you need to offset for that a little bit.
Yeah, no
so
question.
You might bump it up to a 10% increase or a 15% and say, hey, I'm really sorry. This is going to be cheaper than what it's going to go month to month. But because we're ending in December instead of July, when it's really easy for me to rent this property, and you just need to talk it up. I'm going to have a really tough time renting this property, even though that may not be 100% true. Play it up so that you can justify getting a little bit of a premium, because likely you'll need that to offset some vacancy.
And you can even make the argument that the tenant is going to be understanding of that. If you're granting them that 4.5-month extension, they should be okay to pay a premium at that point.
Most tenants are good because you kind of told them, if you've told them up front, like, hey, your options are renew at this pretty good rate or renew at this absolutely exorbitant month-to-month rate. Now that you're talking about offering them a middle option, most of them are like, phew, thank you. I appreciate that. Right. I get it. Like, again, I don't necessarily like it, but I get it. I appreciate it. Also, so we talked a little bit about like charging premium for month to month. Also, when you're doing your renewal, think about when you want to. So it might not just be like that the lease is going to renew at a bad time of the year for you, but if you have several properties and they're all stacked up in the same month, you may not want to be doing that. So this might be your opportunity during the renewal. Instead of doing a 12-month lease extension, maybe you do a 10-month or an 11-month or a 14-month or something like that. The other thing to think about too is what day. This sounds really detailed, and most DIY owners are probably just going to roll their eyes at this. But when you get down to managing properties like this, it kind of becomes like a little bit of a science. So what day of the week and of the month do you want the lease to end on? So I will tell you this from experience. Tenants rent will start a lease at any day during the course of a month. So you don't have to worry about the lease always starting on the 1st and ending on the 31st. In fact, I'd argue that it's kind of tough sometimes if you have them all in on the same day. If you have one or two, it's not such a big deal, but for us, it would be darn near impossible. So I guess what I'm saying though is like, if you end your lease on a Friday and you are the property manager for your property, guess what you're doing Saturday? And instead of being home with your family, right, you're out there scrubbing toilets and doing that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Or maybe that's what you want to do. Maybe that's how you intentionally want to line up. Or if you don't, well, now you've got built in, let's say you write the lease to end on a Friday and you're not going to get back out there till Monday, or no one's working until Monday. Well, guess what? You've just built in like 6 or 7% vacancy for that month. So, $1,500 a day, give or take, or $1,500 a month on a property, that's give or take $50 a day. You just lost $100 mm-hmm. by having no one in there over the weekend.
Just like that.
So have it terminate on a Sunday instead. Mm-hmm. So just be thinking about stuff like that. Like this is, we just saved someone $100 right
there. It
now.
is.
There you go.
It's just some strategic planning.
Welcome. Very much. Okay. So yeah, sorry. I know that's kind of like, that's a lot. The other thing is think about during the summer, what are the best times? Generally speaking, when kids are out of school, are going to be more peak times to have a property to rent. There are going to be more people moving and looking for places then, but people will rent any time of the year. But I guess what I'm saying is like, hey, if the lease was going to end in April, do a 13-month extension mm-hmm. or 14 months instead of 12, something like that. So anyway. Let's
begin
see.
with the end in mind. We always say that.
Ooh, that's very
bringing
nice.
It full circle. There you go.
Full circle. All right. The other thing is just like, hey, if they're saying they want to leave, well, we already kind of talked about this, like, hey, what would we need to do to keep you to stay? Now, within reason. And you might not want to offer that, and they might not be that great of a tenant. And this is a really great opportunity to get rid of someone who's not been a great tenant. Again, back to that complacency, just because they're a warm body paying rent doesn't mean you want them there.
Yeah.
Hopefully most of the time, if you're doing your screening right and setting expectations well and fixing the property and all that stuff, they should be someone you want and are kind of disappointed when they leave, and you want to make sure they know that. And you want to see if there's anything that you can do to help kind of push it over the finish line.
Absolutely.
And if they are in fact moving out and you've kind of determined, hey, I'm not going to be able to negotiate with these folks, start advertising that property ideally 30, 45 days out. Hopefully you kept all the listing photos from when the property was vacant and had fresh paint and carpet and all that. And you can throw that bad boy back up there. And now here's what I would say. Don't go showing the property unless it looks like what you want the next tenant to live like. So if the current tenant's a slob, wait till it's vacant, cleaned, and ready to go before you show it. If you did well on your tenant selection and setting expectations, you can show the property if it looks nice, make sure the tenant knows what the expectations are during showings. To be able to do that, get their cooperation. Should be written into your lease to allow for those showings while they're still there. Now, in the age of COVID, that probably looks a little differently. We've decided to handle that a little differently ourselves, and we're still seeing some good success. But typically, we would be willing to show folks a property that's currently occupied as long as it's going to show well.
Yeah, like Chris said, just make sure you know what you're letting that prospective new tenant see. Because that might have been a qualified tenant, but yeah, they might live like a slob. My gosh.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. And you don't want to attract more slobs.
Exactly.
And drive away the clean ones.
And you would too.
And you will. And I know, I've heard people say, well, I just showed it and I just explained to them that that's not how it's going to be. Well, guess what? Landlords lie all the time and tenants know it. And so they're not like attracts like, and if you show it slobbily, you're going to get sloppily the next time too. And it's just going to be this vicious circle. So the only way you break that circle is by eating the vacancy, eating the repair costs, and then showing the property when it's really ready to rent.
Absolutely.
Cool.
Wow. With that, a couple, actually some really good points, I think, from this episode. When you're thinking about your lease renewal process, plan accordingly. Like we talked about, make sure you know where you're priced right now, where you could be priced in the future, where you might consider offering a lease renewal rate to your tenant. And then, of course, if we need to offer some kind of a sweetener, if you need to offer some kind of a sweetener to get them to stay, what is that? What does that look like? Budget and plan accordingly for it. Because as we've talked about, it is better to have a well-qualified existing tenant than to continue to go through that vicious cycle of turnover. But of course, we want to make sure it's the right tenant.
Yes.
And yeah, doing all these things are going to help you maintain your property. With that, we are the investment property geeks of Charlotte, and we'd like to ask don't forget rather to subscribe and leave us a review. We are happy to hear any kind of feedback you might have for us. Thank you so much for listening. And this is Jesse and Chris wishing you a brighter life through real estate.